on you ask any questions or join in discussion, that will be recorded too. And unless you're speaking, please stay muted so we don't hear your cuckoo clocks and talking parrots in the background. Now, the feedback from our first event a few weeks ago told us that a session on heat pumps would be really popular. So it's great to see so many of you here. Thank you. I'd particularly like to welcome our main speaker, John Cantor, whose reputation goes ahead of him, and we'll be hearing from him very shortly. And our decarboniser, Dominic McCann, who is a member of the Carbon Co-op in Manchester and takes part in a lot of their programmes. We'll be hearing from him too. We'll also be hearing from Gervais Manguana, whom some of you will know. He's Herefordshire. And I hope we'll be hearing from some of you in the audience as well as the evening progresses. Now, at any stage, you're welcome to put some questions into the chat. A few of us will be scanning to select questions for our speakers to answer. So please make questions visible to everybody rather than sending them to a single recipient, to one of our speakers. They may not spot them. Let me just check. Have we got Gervais with us at this stage? No, don't think so. Good. So, are you thinking of switching to a heat pump? They're certainly in the news a lot these days. Oops, just doing a twiddle here. They're certainly in the news a lot these days and forming part of government plans to decarbonise our heating. And decarbonise we must. Our gas boilers are a bigger source of CO2 emissions apparently than our vehicles on the road. And here in Herefordshire, almost half the county's homes aren't connected to the gas network anyhow, which generally means that heating them is even more carbon intensive. Heat pumps are a prominent feature in the government's Powering Our Net Zero Future Energy White Paper, which aims to increase what they're calling voluntary installations of heat pumps. I don't know what enforced ones are, but there you go. Voluntary installation of heat pumps from 30,000 a year at the moment to 600,000 a year by 2028. So that's a bit of a hill to climb. We're going to do a poll in a moment to see how you heat your home. And please note, these polls are anonymous. Nobody will be able to see how it is that you're voting. So, Wendy, would you please prepare poll number 1? And for this one, please, everybody, you just choose one option. So here we go. So how do you heat your home? Oh, we've got people answering already. Yes, I knew we'd have some people with heat pumps already. Excellent, lots of participants. Do we think we're done? Yeah, I think we can. I'll just check that. Yeah, could you share that one then, please, Wendy? There we go. So we've got 3 people. I'm reading this out because these don't show up in the recording. So 3 people, 8% with an air source heat pump. That's grand. Nobody with a ground source heat pump here. Nobody with electric heating. 13 people on mains gas. 5 on LPG, 13 on oil, 2 on efficient biomass such as wood pellets, 3 mainly heating their homes with wood burners, open fires. So that's really interesting. And I hope that John and Dominic, it's interesting for you to see the kind of share of what we've got. Grand. We're going to go straight on to poll number 2, if you would please, then Wendy. Yeah, which is, are you thinking of installing a heat pump soon? It says multiple choice, but please only choose one. Great, lovely. Looks like everyone's done. Would you share that one then, please, Wendy? Great. So I'll read it out again. So 45%, that's 18 people, are keen to get on with it in the next year or so. 14, that's 35%, maybe, but still with some questions or concerns. And 8, 20% saying no, but I'm still interested to hear about them. Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. Lovely. Now, have we been joined in the meantime by Gervais Mangwana? I think he hasn't made it. He's going to dash in to join us in a change to our advertised program, so to speak. We haven't. So what we'll do is see if we can squeeze him in when he does arrive. But I'd very much like to welcome... Somebody say something?
Just arrived, Jackie.
Hey, that's terrific. Good. So I would very much like to welcome Gervais Mangwana to join us. And some of you will have met Gervais on one of our previous events, and he works as a retrofit assessor. And I have got a question for him, which I can't find here. Just a GIF. Here we are. So, are you with us with us, Gervais? Yeah, there he comes. Hi, well done. That's marvelous. So, in a change to our advertised schedule, as they say on TV, we're going to start off with a quick chat with retrofit assessor Gervais Mangwana. So, Gervais, when a heat pump is going into a building, it's really important, isn't it, to do a heat loss calculation. And that's something that an installer would normally do, or a qualified assessor like yourself. So can you tell us what the process is, what you're looking for when you do that?
Okay. So, yeah, I think well, certainly for a grant approved system, the installer would have to do a heat loss calc via the methodology they used for the MCS accreditation, which is probably a room by room calculation. I do assessments mostly for people powered retrofit in Manchester, and obviously the question of heat pumps has come up more and more, and we probably have a slightly different approach to a lot of heat pump installers, in that we absolutely stick to a fabric first approach, and we try not to be in getting into a position where we're sort of recommending or even approving clients' wishes for a heat pump until they've driven their fabric down to a level where the heat pump that they'll install is of a sensible size, and that's usually about 8 kilowatts as a maximum. So if I can share my screen, can I share my screen?
Oh yes, please do. That's great. And the reason you want them to do that is that you don't want to get them to get locked into an oversized system, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, partly that, but also just because bigger heat pumps, more power going in. I mean, I'm sure John will talk about this later. Yeah, the problems with cycling and yes, just generally having too large a plant that is required isn't a good idea in heat pumps. It's something we've always done in gas boilers, mostly because they're sized for the hot water side and because it's very easy for them to cycle in a way that it isn't so much for a heat pump.
Sure.
So have you given me permission now? You have.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So yeah, I just thought I'd try. I don't have very long at all, but I just thought I'm between lasagna and bathing children, so I just thought I'd talk through just very quickly what we do. So I'll do a heat loss calculation for our houses. We go to people's houses for a number of different reasons, but the heat pump question is coming up more and more. And the first thing we do is measure up the whole house and make an assessment of the construction, the windows, how leaky it might be. And that'll come up with a figure, which you can see here in the middle, which is the heat loss per degree difference between the temperature that you'd want heat it to inside and the worst case, and any case outside. So it's per degree difference between inside and outside. And this graphic sort of shows you where we would assess that those losses were going. So in this house, sorry if my bar's in the way of you there, as with most houses, the walls are one of the biggest things. In fact, in this house, it's deemed that it's the drafts are sort of the next big thing, and then the windows and the floor. And once I've done that, we put that all together, and that can come up with a peak heat loss, which you can see here in this red number here. And that's for sort of the worst case scenario, where the difference between the temperature inside at 21 degrees, which is sort of the standard for the standard assessment procedure, SAP, and like -3 outside. So that says that in those conditions, just taking the fabric of the house, you would need to be putting 10.5 kilowatts of heat into the house just to maintain the temperature. So that's as we found the house when we turned up. Actually, I think this is a house that I did for somebody in Brecon, so more relevant to us here in Herefordshire. And then we suggest 3 scenarios of deeper and deeper retrofit. And as those scenarios get deeper, the need for that peak heat drops over time. But now what we started doing in the last sort of year or so is when we do these assessments, I also assess the radiators. And that means going around and measuring the size of the radiators, where they are. So these are all the radiators that are in that house, what type they are. And can we get rid of this? And then from some calculations which come from the manufacturers of radiators, at the output that you would expect from a fossil fuel boiler, so that's what that FF means there, so a gas boiler it was in this case, this is the output that you'd expect from that boiler. And that comes to 16.3 kilowatts. So you can see in this case, for this house, the overall heat loss is only 10.5, and the radiators are kicking out 16.3, or can kick out 16.3 kilowatts of heat. So comfortably, it should be able to heat the house. As it happens, it couldn't, but I think that's because she had a problem with her boiler. And then what we can also do is estimate that given those radiators, with the lower flow temperatures that you'll be finding out about this, I expect, the lower flow temperatures that are good for the efficiency of a heat pump, the output of the radiator at that size and that type, whether it's got 2 panels, 2 fins, or it's just one single panel, or all those have different output profiles, then the total heat output drops significantly. And in this case, under those circumstances, it would drop to this value 6.6. And that is no longer enough to keep the house warm to 21 degrees when it's very cold outside. So you just simply wouldn't be able to get the house up to temperature. So as it happens in this house, there was an extension that had not been heated at all. So what I then did just to go back to these scenarios. So as the scenarios get deeper, so this 7.5 would still be, so there's sort of some minimal measures that might be done to the place. That still wouldn't be enough to heat the house. At this deeper scenarios, then we're starting to get to a place where the radiators themselves, regardless of what size heat pump was on it, the radiators themselves would be able to output enough heat. So what then I proposed is that we changed all the radiators, kept them the same size, but changed them all to double fin radiators and added 3 radiators into the place that was unheated. And even then, there still wasn't quite enough heat with a heat pump to meet the house as it is now. But if she was to do these minimal measures, then probably it would be okay. She could probably put in an 8 kilowatt heat pump and just about be okay. But we generally try to advise people to get down to whatever is practical. A lower kind of a lower peak heat loss is practical to get a heat pump in. So that was probably all a bit quick and technical, but yeah, if you've got any questions, then do ask.
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Gervais. There probably are a few questions, and we know we've only got you really for a few minutes.
Yeah, you've got me for another few minutes. Yeah, so.
Yeah. Okay. So if anyone's got a specific question to Gervais that's in the chat, please put it in the chat.
I've got one from Dave Green, which is about isn't SAP referring to 21 degrees for the living room, 18 degrees elsewhere?
There is. It depends on the living area that you allocate to it. So yeah, there is a bit of an offset. It isn't. You're right. It's not 21 degrees for the whole house.
Yeah. Okay. But presumably, one rather useful thing that people can do is track the temperature of the rooms that they use, the temperature they like their rooms to be. Is that the sort of thing you also ask people to do, Gervais?
Well, we generally ask people how they control their heating. And there are myriad responses to that.
I'm sure there are, yeah. But the point is that the calculations you do typically take into account the fact that the temperature of the water flowing through the radiators is going to be lower than in most gas or oil-fired central heating systems. But that's not unique to heat pumps, is it? So, for instance, I lived in a house with where we swapped the control system for our gas central heating, and the flow temperatures went right down, and it was beautifully comfortable, and the boiler was working much less hard, and it worked fine. And where I live now, we've got a low temperature system, which is, wood pellets. So there are comfort aspects to do with that low temperature. If you're fairly well insulated, it's really nice to have a comfortable room rather than a great hot thing in the corner.
Absolutely, yeah.
That cuts air, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And because of that, heat pumps are, do they lend themselves to underfloor heating, because that's generally done at lower flow temperatures as well, and you can keep that very low. If you've got a very low heat loss, you can keep the flow temperatures into the floor very, very low and keep the heat pump very, very happy.
We've got a good question from Trish Marsh, because I think it's commonly occurring for people.
Go for it.
I was just thinking that, for 95% of the year, it's above -3. So sometimes, isn't it just worth having a couple of blower heaters around, and, the rest of the year you'll be fine? That's just a thought.
Yeah. I suppose it's a question of how much. Yeah, obviously for a large part of the year, you hope, especially if you've done a bit of work on your fabric, then you won't be using your heating at all. But yeah, if you've gone through a winter like we've just gone through now, then a lot of the time you would have been using those blower heaters, and they would be at significant cost. Right. And not particularly pleasant either.
Mm-hmm. But not to worry on that, because that's the sort of thing that we'll also be able to cover with John shortly. So I think if anyone's got another question for Gervais, who has to dash off to domestic duties, give a frantic wave now.
Yes, may I? It's Ray Hunter. Gervais, just to say that in your example, you showed, I couldn't count how many, but a number of the radiators being changed.
Yep.
I had understood that low temperature radiators are quite different in design. Could you say something about that?
Or in fact, let me just check I think that might be something we'll pick up with John, isn't it, John?
Yeah. John.
Right, oh, fine.
Thank you, Ray, for your question.
I know that Gervais has not paid me to advertise, but he did a very good job for us, which led, I got the report 2 days ago.
Delighted to hear it. That's great. That's great.
Yeah, I just really wanted to give an overview on how having a whole house assessment and attending to the fabric first. I mean, it sounds a little bit like what you're suggesting. I think was it Trish? Is that, you know, maybe you can get away with just putting a heat pump in and not doing anything to your fabric. And yeah, without actually the example that I gave there was quite a close match. But in many cases, especially in houses around here, the difference between what the heat loss is and what the output would be of the radiators at even a reasonable temperature and for, you know, different more warmer times of the year is still not a good match. I was just hunting around for an example that had sort of reasonably good numbers in it, but it just shows the importance of making sure that heat loss calculation has been done and the assessment of the radiator system is done. But heat pump installers will do that for you, but they might not necessarily drive you down to a smaller system. And I think that's, you know, it's probably all about picking the right installer. And I've come across cases with clients around here recently where they haven't necessarily pushed them into doing the fabric stuff that they could have done, and the MCS has let it through on an EPC for one reason or another. And it's just a bit disappointing to see that very large heat pumps are going in to cope with houses where, you know, fairly easy work could have been done to make the loss, you know, the loss less. And I know Jackie's made the point that, and you're kind of stuck with a very large heat pump, and if you want to do that work in the future, it's an oversized piece of plant. I know there's probably implications for that, which John will be able to tell you about. I can't hear you now, Jackie.
I can't hear you, Jackie.
I can very faintly hear you, Jackie, so it sounds like there might be a problem with your microphone.
I'll just step in the meantime. We've got a question from John Cook about roughly, just very quickly, what do scenarios 1, 2, and 3 consist of?
Oh no, you got me.
Just very roughly, don't worry.
So in this case, the first case, I think she was. I mean, it's very difficult to say without. The numbers could say anything. I don't think the wall insulation came in until the second phase. So it was increasing the loft insulation, doing the cavities on the extension, and replacing the windows, and crucially dealing with that really bad air tightness. So this infiltration was really high. So getting some really sort of good draft proofing done. And then in the second scenario, it was it was actually a mid terrace, so there wasn't a lot of exposed walls. So doing the front and back walls came in the second scenario.
Not really.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, John.
Yes.
I thought that was excellent, Gervais. That was great.
Oh, well, that's great.
Very, very interesting.
Right, I'll leave you. I'll go and bathe 2 monsters. Have a great call.
Thanks, Gervais. Thanks very much.
Okay, shall I just take it away?
Yes, please, John. Thanks.
Right, I'm going to share a screen. Hopefully it'll work. And here we go. Is that okay? Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Yep, great. Okay, so this is me, John Cantor. That's my website where there's quite a bit of information. Hopefully it's useful. It was very interesting listening to Gervais, and I should flag up my book, but I'm flagging up this little simulator, which is quite interesting because he was talking about radiator sizes and things. You'll find this on my website as a simulator. And you can do very quick assessments of radiator sizing. I'm not going to explain that, but it's there for people to sort of play around with. And there's another one on the pressure drops and pipe sizes. Pipe sizes are the thing that people often guess, and they shouldn't. So I'm going to be fairly brief with this. The first slide is simply just to put heat pumps in context, because it's nothing like a new technology. And in the 1980s, Sweden was one country that embraced the technology. There's lots of heat pumps out there. And here in the UK, heat pumps weren't always seen favourably, but we can see why, because, over 10 years ago, electricity was fairly dirty, a lot of coal generation. And it's quite impressive what's happened in the last 10 years. We've now halved the pollution rate of electricity. So electricity as a form of energy is a lot better. And of course, if we've got a heat pump, we can multiply it by a factor of 3 or 4 or whatever. So they are more viable. Let's just firstly look at what the hardware we're talking about. Mostly we'd be either considering an air source heat pump like this one, this is a Mitsubishi EcoDan, and this on the right is a ground source heat pump in an outhouse or a garage, this one. The air source, I'm not going to explain how they work because you can look that up, but this draws air through and extracts the heat from the outside air and produces hot water, which will go to a standard, well, not exactly standard, but a network of radiators or underfloor heating. And the ground source will do a similar thing, provide underfloor heating or radiators. And the actual heat comes from pipes in the ground. I'm just going to show you this because it shouldn't be taken lightly. It's quite an upheaval. This, though, is for quite a big property, so you'd expect quite large trenches. And there's, I think, 4 trenches like this. Of course, when you look at that, it's quite frightening, but after 6 months or so, when it's all settled down, it's no problem. And of course, it should last 50 years or whatever, a long, long time, actually. Boreholes are the other option. I'm not going to discuss any detail about that, only to say that boreholes are usually quite expensive, and you can do a lot for your money for horizontal trenches if you've got the space. Again, always think of the insulation. It was great to hear Gervais talk about getting the insulation level down, because if that can be done, of course, everything gets easier, everything gets smaller. I just want to discuss a couple of things here so that no one's sort of left behind with the basics. This is very simple. All it shows is the heat pump there, and this is the measure of efficiency of a heat pump, which you've really got to understand if you're going to think of using one. And here we're just representing what a heat pump does. It takes electrical energy in, extracts heat from outside, and delivers it to where you want it in the house. We've all got a heat pump anyway. A fridge is a heat pump, exactly the same thing, really. It's the same principle, the same mechanism. It takes heat from the icebox, which is already cold. And here we are showing the efficiency ratio, which is the heat output divided by the power input, which can be between 2 and 5. And just to be clear, when I say 2 and 5, I mean that a specific heat pump, depending on how it's used, may operate between 2 and 5, meaning that we may get twice the output compared to the electrical input, or 5 times. And it depends on the temperature conditions. In the same way that a car, the MPG will be pretty bad if you're, got a headwind and you're going uphill. Heat pumps are sensitive to how they operate, the conditions they're operating in. This graph is also interesting, relates to what Gervais was saying. any of you who don't like graphs, this is, believe me, this is quite simple. This on this scale here, we've got the COP ratio. So 7, if we could get a ratio of 7, that would be amazing, but we almost never will. On this scale, we've got the outside temperature, and this is the air source heat pump I showed you on the slide at the beginning. It is a variable output heat pump. What I've got on here are 4 options for the efficiency depending on the temperature that the heat pump is that's going through the heat pump. And you hope that the water going through the heat pump is about equal to the radiator temperature. So let's look at the bottom one here, which is a radiator at 55 degrees. Now that's hot, that's sort of boiler temperature. And what we see is that the air source heat pump, when it's -10 outside, oops, I wasn't meaning to do that. When it's -10 outside, the, lost my mouse, the COP is about 2. And when it's 10 or 15 degrees outside, the COP raises up to about 3, which is not very good. On the other end of the spectrum, if we can heat water to only 25, which isn't even lukewarm, it's barely warm at all, then if it's really cold out, the COP can be just under 4, but it could go up to 7. But there's really nothing we want to use up here because it's you don't need any heating. For most of us, we'd work in the middle, typically radiators here. Underfloor heating here at maybe 35 if we're lucky. It's a good system if it's in a fairly well insulated house. We might be operating radiators, say 45 on an older building, maybe radiators somewhere in the middle on a slightly...
no longer webinaring.
But here's someone talking there. So what I've done there is I've superimposed a line here, which does relate exactly to what Gervais was saying. And what this is showing that if, for example, we have, let's put the next one on. Let's say, for example, we have we work out we need 9 kilowatts and we need a radiator as hot as 55, which is not good at all, but let's say that's what we're doing. We can see that that radiator then will need to be at 55 degrees when it's minus 7 or -5. But of course, as it gets slightly warmer, meaning 0, not quite so cold, the radiator will only need to be about 45. And as the outside air temperature gets even warmer, then the radiator may only need to be at 35. So if our heat pump is controlled properly, then we can operate on that sort of green line. And our COP, we're maximizing the COP. Now can be quite hard to achieve, although most heat pumps will have weather compensation. It's quite important to get that detail right. Although I don't want to frighten you off by worrying about this, because a lot of systems should cope with that fine. But what is very interesting here, which relates to the lady who mentioned the blower heater, is that let's say most of the winter we're operating around here. The average winter temperature is sort of right in the middle. And if we designed our system, I know Gervais said designing to -3, which is about here, but the heat pump doesn't need to be that big for much of the time. And of course, if it's we're only needing 3 kilowatts at 35, it's quite hard to get the heat pump to be efficient. It's a bit like going to the shops with a 3-litre car. It's not that efficient. So I'm all for, in fact, smaller heat pumps, and even in the middle of winter, on the coldest day that you needed to bring a fan heater out of the cupboard, it's noisy and quite expensive to run. People won't run them for very long. Anyway, that's my personal opinion. I think heat pumps are often too big. what have I missed? Yes, I just wanted to say some confusion around here that we might get -10, but of course not over 24 hours or for a couple of days. And there's a bit of, we really need to concentrate more on, we don't have to worry too much, in my opinion, of -10, because a lot of buildings will hold over. I guess not all, though. Right, I'm just going to mention now the concept, the difference between air source and ground source, because a lot of people will be asking this question, what do I want, air or ground? The whole idea of ground source was that, or is that, our winter tends to come on fairly quickly, and when we get a sort of a sub-zero snap, an air source will be suffering. Well, sorry, I should say the ground source will be potentially better, because the ground, which is nominally 10 degrees, a metre and a half down, when that cold snap comes on, it maintains its efficiency. But over the last, say, 15 years or so, air source have got a lot better. So now they need a defrost mechanism to melt the ice inside. These have been optimized, they're refined. So we've seen a definite swing towards air source. And if your house is small, well, if your heat demand is small, then often an air source is a better choice. Whereas if you've got a fairly old building or a large building and your fuel bills are high, then it may be worth the investment of a ground source. I think I've said enough there. And finally, just to look at where the heat's delivered, this picture on the right is underfloor heating with very close spacing with a screed. The benefit of a lot of pipe is that the water temperature in those pipes it can be quite low, maybe 35 degrees, for example. So that means the heat pump's efficiency will be high. You'd have this sort of manifold, and I've shown one without any mixing valve, because ideally you want the heat pump to pump directly to the underfloor. So if you want 35 degrees here, you hope the heat pump is only a little bit above that. Floor coverings for older buildings, ideally if it's polished concrete or tiled or something, but interestingly for passive house, even your surface may only be 22, 23, and actually your feet can be cold. So quite a lot of passive house people would tend to put a wooden covering over that. But in an old building, it would be a bit of an insulator. And now radiators, this is a standard Stelrad sort of radiator, and this is a Jaeger, more optimized for heat pumps. Someone asked the question, what's the difference, or what can you do? Well, in some ways, a lot of the radiator is just a panel, a sort of a steel surface that emits radiation and also convection, a bit of both. They're improved with fins in the middle that you can't see. But I've always felt that some of these have been sold unfairly, as a lot of things are. So the advantage with this one on the left here, it'll distribute the water more evenly, whereas the one on the right, you're relying on the warmed water coming through, and sort of usually there's convection currents that take it up and etc. So there may not be a very even surface. So it's definitely better to go for this sort of radiator. Having said that, there's nothing really wrong with using these. It's often down to the surface. You can get triple panel radiators. Personally, I sometimes feel it better to have two narrower radiators, one each side of a room, than a triple one, because they just look a bit nicer. I'm not going to say much more about that, and I think I've sort of finished and was hoping we'd have some questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks very much, John. Can people hear?
Back to Jackie, if I can hear her. Can you hear, or can we hear you, Jackie?
Can you hear me?
Just
very faintly.
Oh dear, Okay, something's got itself reset while I was mid-flow, clearly.
Fine now.
That's better. Okay.
Yeah, is that better?
Yeah,
Good. I'll just shout a bit. If I'm shouting too loud, let me know. John, thank you very much indeed for that. And there are a couple of points I'd like to just pick up before we see what other people are asking. So from what you've said there then, with both the underfloor heating and with radiators working at low temperature, the heat is coming direct from the heat pump. It's not that there's a big tank somewhere that's a heat store. So is that right?
Well, it is. It of course, there's a big debate here because going back in time, there were more buffer tanks. I mean, the issue here is that you may need a buffer tank, partly to deal with the on-off cycling. In other words, when you don't need a lot of heat, a boiler can just stop and start quite happily, fairly quickly, but heat pumps don't really like that. So the buffer tank is to give it a bit of volume, but a buffer tank is only a sort of 20 minutes storage at best, really. So it does that function, but it can introduce a sort of temperature difference. Now, when inverter heat pumps come in, I forgot to mention that. Did I not mention it? Inverter drives, meaning variable speed. You'll see a lot of things now that have inverters, that buffer tanks can sort of be designed out. I always used to like buffer tanks. I've sort of gone off them a bit, but it's an art for bigger houses. It may be necessary.
You haven't mentioned domestic hot water at all.
I haven't.
Yeah. We're just going to ask that, in fact. So
yeah,
what happens about domestic hot water, the hot water to come out of the taps? Is it going to be at the right temperature from the heat pump?
No, you definitely need a cylinder if you're going to do hot water. What a heat pump generally does is it will feed the underfloor heating, and that will be at a certain temperature. And then it will divert with a 3-port valve or whatever to heat a cylinder. You can't get instant heating out of any heat pump, really. Because its capacity, it wouldn't make sense to do that, to run it briefly at high power. So it would have to have a cylinder, and it would then operate at a higher temperature. So the energy efficiency will be lower, but nonetheless, nearly every heat pump has that facility in its controller. So it's a normal thing to do. Is that enough? There's quite a lot to do on that, but
there's quite a lot to do. Let's pause that for now and see if people can. There might be some more questions later. But basically, you're saying for hot water, you'll need a cylinder. It can be heated by the heat pump. It's got the capacity to do it. But you might sometimes need to top it up with an immersion heater, say?
Not necessarily. Several years ago, the refrigerants used and just the way heat pumps were, it wasn't quite enough. So sometimes you have to store it at 50 degrees. And now the Legionella, at one time, we used to store at 45 degrees in a big tank and it was fine. But now Legionella worries. You would often use an immersion heater, but quite a few of the refrigerants now allow going up to 60 or sometimes more. So a heat pump can do the whole lot without having to use electric.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I'll just check with Gordon, who's fielding questions. Gordon, have you found more questions relating to this?
Yes, we do. Yeah, I'll just ask a few of them.
Thank you.
A few things on what are disadvantages. Are there any other disadvantages? Question again from Trish Marsh about what heat pumps don't like. What conditions do they not operate well in?
High water temperatures. Difficult to answer that one.
Isn't it? Is it below -5 or when the outside conditions or not? Or
well, it just the efficiency drops off. I mean, there's quite a few in Norway, a cold country, air source heat pumps. But then the thing is, if you're not now, electricity is better. Arguably, we can have heat pumps that are not as energy efficient. I don't really like that, but you know, they still work down to -15 or so. But it's better to operate them at a higher temperature, outside temperature.
Okay.
I saw a question. What was it? Oh, do they have to run all night? That's another thing I haven't really picked up on. Okay, with boilers, the way we're traditionally used to heating is we fire it up in the morning for getting up, and then it goes off. Now, the thing about a heat pump is it's not going to work very well like that. Or it's going to work better if, rather than have the radiators hot for a short period of time, as that graph showed, it's better to run them for longer at a lower temperature. So generally, it's better to start earlier at a low temperature. You understand what I mean? If you want to get the house warm in an hour, got to be quite a hot radiator. Let's start earlier, and the COP can be better. And it's also found better to keep, rather than turn off, actually just turn down, particularly in a well-insulated building. And interestingly, quite a few houses where the heat pump is kept on all the time, enabled all the time, find it's actually cheaper to run or same to run, and the house is just kept. It's simpler. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, John. And one question I think is quite important, particularly if a sort of a normal plumber is installing your heat pump. The question is, how much bigger than the minimum do you recommend the heat pump to be? I think that's a difficult and dangerous topic, isn't it? Sorry, the minimum? The minimum size. How much bigger than the minimum do you recommend the heat pump to be? In other words, what I think in the past it connects with the idea that a gas boiler was always sized up, as Gervais.
Obviously, well, to be honest, I'd say don't size up at all, really. I mean, yeah. Well, I'm sure other people would not quite agree, but for me, in the depth of winter, well, okay, for an air source heat pump, certainly my heat pump runs all the time when it's cold. It's just on, flat out. But then we top up with wood stoves, and that is quite handy because we don't have to worry about that. But generally, if you don't have that option, I still would tend to run pretty close. Now, some people find that a bit risky because it's possible that you might have a slight shortfall. But you've got to weigh that up with the fact that if it's oversized, then the total energy over the year could be considerably more because it's running so inefficiently on the average day, the average winter's day.
Great,
okay.
Thanks for those. I think we'll move on soon to our next speaker and then come back with more questions. There is just one that I've seen, Gordon, that we'll just run by John though, which is about using electricity when it is available with low carbon electricity, because we know how the carbon profile of the power that gets delivered to us goes up and down according to various weather conditions and things. Is there a way that you can get an air source or a heat pump system to run to take advantage of those lower carbon periods?
This is a bit difficult because if you're going to store, as well, we're going to hear from Dominic in a minute. You can have it, which is good. Because I must admit that I probably, to store heat can be a little bit difficult because a normal buffer tank will only store so much. And inevitably, by storing it, you're going to have to make it hotter than it would otherwise be. So your COP will be less. And also, if you're going to run the air source overnight, the COP will be less. But it can be advantageous. It's quite tricky to get the balance there. And I don't know if I can give you the proper answers there, other than, yes, I mean, obviously it's worth running. It's worth making that balance and trying to use electricity at night.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Good. Well, thank you ever so much, John. Let's move on now to our next speaker, Dominic McCann, as I've said, from Manchester. And Dominic is quite extraordinary in that he has been monitoring the energy consumption of his home for many years. And this meant that when Dominic thought heat pump, he had got a lot of data and had done a sort of dry run, I think I'll describe it. So yeah, Dominic, can we hear from you, please?
Yes, hello, I'm Dominic McCann. I'm just going to share this screen, which will be my presentation. So we'll start at the beginning. There we go. Yeah. Present. Okay, so this is my presentation, which is kind of my journey towards a heat pump, which has taken us, since basically moving to this house. So I started monitoring our energy use in the house about 22 years ago, I suppose. But we moved in about 1995. It's a traditional, it's almost a terraced house, but it's technically a semi-detached because we are detached from one side, just with an alleyway between us and the neighbour. So we moved in 1995 and it hadn't been modernised at all, the house. So we modernised it as best we could, not knowing very much about what to do, but we knew there was a carbon emissions problem. So we did what we thought was a modern refurbishment. We took out the gas fires, it didn't have any central heating. We put in central heating, radiators and a combi boiler, and took out the hot water cylinder that was in the bathroom, which was already very small. So we needed the space in the bathroom for the cylinder. Well, to take the cylinder out was a win as far as we were concerned. But obviously decisions you make along the way have impacts on how you live in the house and what you can do. So yeah, as I said, I started tracking our carbon emissions probably from about 2002 onwards properly. So, and then this sort of led me to think, well, we need to make gradual improvements to the fabric and the air tightness. It's still not energy efficient enough. And we had a few bits and bobs done to the house, like a loft conversion, which again can influence, as we'll see later, about things like where to put a cylinder if you need a hot water cylinder. So we had a loft conversion. I'm sitting in the loft right now. We had a dining room extension, and then we had a big improvement to our energy efficiency in 2014, when we had a whole house retrofit done by Carbon Co-op. So we had, can you see the back of our house there? You can see the external wall insulation. Actually, you can see our dining room extension, which is the timber-clad structure next to the house, or attached to the house. And you can see at the front, we had external wall insulation. You can't really tell, but there's a white strip on the left-hand side of the picture. That's the external wall insulation down the side of the house. And then it wraps around the other sides of the house at the back. So we had, external wall insulation, some triple glazing, underfloor insulation, and some improved ventilation and air tightness. So this led me to think, how ready are we for a heat pump? What do we need to do? So basically I had a dry run, as Jackie said. I thought I'll try turning down on our fairly basic Worcester Bosch combi boiler, the flow temperature to the radiators. So I thought I'll try 40 degrees. That seems to be the starting point for an air source heat pump, or approximately where they like to run a lot of the time. So I thought I'll try that. And this is, I don't want to get technical, but basically I collect all the data I can from our house in its energy use. And I thought I'd try seeing if it improved the efficiency of the system as well by running it at 40 degrees. So basically measuring how much gas we use at different outside temperatures, all running at 40 degrees, which started in January it started in February 2020, and I ran the trial for 13 months until we had the air source heat pump installed, which was 3 weeks ago. So this was the data for this January, which was probably the coldest month we've had. Is it 10 years? Yeah, it's been January was a cold month anyway. We had temperatures down to -7 probably in Manchester overnight. So that's what the cold on this graph, the coldest temperatures are at the top. So basically it's the difference between the outside temperature and the inside temperature. That's how we measure the heat loss as well. So I also, because I measure everything, was measuring how many minutes our gas central heating system was on. So again, this is January, just gone January 2021. And this is how many minutes our gas system was heating for each day, and essentially how cold it was. So the higher it is, the colder it was. And you can see at 40 degrees, our gas boiler was running for 900 minutes approximately. It was still fine, everything was fine. So what that said to me was, at 40 degrees, everything's fine. We're probably ready for an air source heat pump. When I say, so the results were that running at 40 degrees, the heating was on 10% longer than it had been when we'd been running it hotter at say 55 degrees or 60 degrees. But we were using 15% less gas. So if you can run your system cooler, it's a win-win, whatever the situation. But what you will find is, as Gervais showed and John has said, there might be some rooms where it doesn't get warm enough. If your radiators aren't big enough, then that's what you'll find. Running it cooler may mean that some rooms are no longer warm enough. But because we had our house so well insulated over the years, it was, and that was the finding. So there was no loss really for us. We did upgrade one radiator, and I did know that our dining room extension, although it's really well insulated, had a tiny radiator, so it was going to need a bigger one. So I'm not suggesting everyone should go down this route of calculating and collecting all their own data, because that's what a decent installer should do. But I thought I'd do it, and so other people don't have to. You know, this is my experience, and what can we all learn from it? Because that, as a member of Carbon Co-op, that's what I like to do, is share, learn from other people, and share what I personally have learned. So, you know, I looked, well, one issue that cropped up was that we were very tight for space. That was so essentially our heating radiator system was pretty much ready for a heat pump, and our heat loss was quite low, well, very low really. So at this -3 temperature that Gervais mentioned, our heat loss is about 4.2 kilowatts. So that, you know, that's within the range of lots of the smaller size of air source heat pumps. But we were tight for space, and we ended up with a very sort of, well, a slightly experimental solution where we've installed, instead of having a cylinder for hot water, we've got what's called a sun amp. Essentially, it is just a cylinder or a storage of heat, but it's more compact. So we were able to put it outside, as you can see on this visualization of the back of our house. So you can see probably the air source heat pump here was the idea, to put it there, and to put the storage of hot water here outside the house, if you can see my mouse. We tried other locations for a traditional cylinder, but it was always tricky to run the pipes sort of from this. It was either in the loft, in the crawl space, or part of the loft that I'm sat in, but it would have involved running pipes either externally up the house here, quite a long way. It was feasible, but we ended up with this solution. So this is our air source heat pump install, which started on the 6th of April. And we've ended up with a Niebuhr 6 kilowatts air source heat pump, which can run up to 55 degrees. And as John suggested, that's pretty normal for air source heat pumps. They can ramp up to serve a hot water system. So in our case, not a traditional cylinder, but the sun amp, which requires it to have sort of 50 to 52 degrees supplied from the air source heat pump, and it's storing the heat at about 48. So it needs a little bit extra heat just to store it in there, but it's fine at that sort of temperature. So basically it took 2 days to install. And this is as it was happening. You can see the sun amp going there and the air source heat pump going over here, pretty much as I sketched it. And this is the finished job. So we housed everything that, well, we've got the air source heat pump over here, and we've got effectively the hot water storage here outside the house, in a fully insulated box or enclosure. All the pipes are lagged, and yeah, that's how it looks. So yeah, as I said, it's kind of an experimental solution. It's not normal to put your hot water storage outside the house, although quite often they would go in a garage or something like that. It's not that unusual, I suppose. Yeah, as I'll be collecting the performance data and sharing it with SunAmp and Carbon Co-op and pretty much anyone else who wants to share and find out how it works. So this is what we ended up with inside the house, in the kitchen. I don't have a similar shot exactly. You can see where our boiler was over here, and this is the corner of our kitchen where it was. And it's a very small kitchen, just a galley kitchen. There's kind of the same thing as this worktop, just on the other side, with the hob, and yeah, that's pretty much it in the kitchen. And you can see what it's like afterwards. We've lost the boiler, and we've got the control system here that went in for the air source heat pump housed inside this cupboard. And these are the radiators, the only radiators we actually had replaced for the air source heat pump installed. This one isn't, the bathroom one isn't so much to get more heat, it's just we wanted a towel radiator. It actually gives the same amount of heat, probably. It's just probably about 5% more than the single panel, single finned radiator that was there before. I don't have a photo of it, but it's quite a bit bigger than the single panel, single finned radiator that was there before, but it's nicer to have a towel radiator anyway. And then we had the K3, the triple deeper radiator fitted in the dining room. The kitchen is just there, so it's just next door, it's there. Anyway, and then for me, it's all about carbon emissions. So this is the story of how we've managed to bring down the carbon emissions from our house. So sort of 10 years ago or 12 years ago, our house was emitting 5.5 tons a year of carbon from gas and electricity combined. And then after the carbon co-op retrofit and so on, we were down to about 2.5 tons of carbon in 2020. And I've estimated that a full year with the air source heat pump will result in emissions being around 1.3 tons for the house, electricity and gas combined, and actually running our car as well, because our car is now on the as it's an EV, it's running on the electric. So that 1.3 tons includes driving. So that's it really. Conclusions. I think preparation, thinking about it, helps quite a lot. So you don't necessarily need to do all the data collecting and so on, but if you can collect your bills for the last, say, 18 months and look at how much gas and electricity you've used, that's a great starting point. Obviously, pooling our skills and collaborating with others, that's a great thing to do. So we're all here to do that this evening. That's what it's all about. Even if you can't go to an air source or ground source heat pump, if you can run your system cooler, it will help. So the other little benefits we found were that we had 1 or 2 radiators that would fill up with gas or air, and you'd have to bleed the radiators every few months, say, when they were running hot. And running your system cooler means that generally the pipes and the radiators don't corrode as quickly. So, and that's what's causing the air to fill up, and that's where you need to bleed your radiators, is typically because there's a little bit of corrosion happening at that high temperature. So there's, and it's generally more comfortable really to run them, if you can, at say 40 degrees, run your radiators, than it is to have them burning hot and then turn them off because it's got too hot in the room and the room cools down and you're forever chasing the right temperature. But if you can run them at a cooler temperature for longer, it's generally more comfortable. So what next? I'm still learning about our air source heat pump. I can partly answer the question about using electricity at off-peak, and so the hope for our case, and I've already put this into the controller, is that I've reduced the target temperature of the house for the peak time in the evening, so that's between 4 and 7 p.m. in the evening, when electricity tends to be more carbon intensive because everyone's using electricity at the same time, and that means that gas-fired power stations, and possibly in winter whatever small amount of coal is still on the system will get turned on by the operators of the power stations. So electricity at those times will tend to be more carbon. So what I'm aiming at is that I haven't got a cylinder or a buffer tank. I'm aiming for the efficiency of our house, because it is well insulated, to mean that we can just ride out that peak time between 4 and 7, turning down the heating by 1 or 2 degrees, and probably not lose more than about half or possibly 1 degree in that period between 4 and 7, 3-hour period. Yeah, so maybe that answers that a little bit, but I'm still learning about that, and we probably won't know how much that works until next winter, because we haven't really got cold weather anymore. Well, it was quite cold in around the 10th of April, wasn't it? Yeah, so questions?
Yeah, well, thanks ever so much, Dominic. I think the detail that you've gone into there is great, and thanks for sharing it with us. That's grand. A few more questions have come up specific to yours. I did spot one going past saying, back when you were doing the low temperature gas heating, how did you do your hot water? But I think it was a combi boiler, so it would have just sprung into action. Is that right?
Yeah, so it was a combi boiler, so it didn't affect that. You're turning down the temperature on a combi doesn't turn down the hot water. If they do have a control, they might have a separate hot water temperature control, but ours doesn't or didn't. It just had a radiator temperature control. It didn't have anything for the hot water.
And can I ask you another question? I mean, you've gone this slightly unconventional route with your sun amp, so that's quite intriguing. But this issue in smaller houses, it's quite a big deal, isn't it, with getting pipe work in? The same thing goes sometimes for adding solar thermal. You know, where are you going to run the pipes? Where are you going to put the cylinder? Is that something that you're coming up against quite a lot in town where you are?
Well, obviously, in our case, that was the big stumbling block about where to put a cylinder. So that's why we've ended up with this slightly experimental setup. And it is something that I anecdotally, I think from other carbon co-op members, often hear. Yeah, so, and when we were trying to get quotes for an air source heat pump system, it was often the stumbling block to actually even getting a quote. It was, well, we can't find a way to put a cylinder in your house. So either, well, yeah. So sometimes you would just get a company that that declined to quote.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So all I can report is my anecdotal experience, really.
Grand. Okay, thanks ever so much. Well, look, if you stop sharing your screen for us, that'd be grand. We'll spring over to some more questions. I think Gordon's been gathering some, but before that, I wanted to just go back to John, if I could. There's been a bit of a chat going on about solar and heat pumps. Obviously, we've got two solar technologies: solar PV, which is producing electricity that might be useful with a heat pump, and solar thermal that provides hot water that might work well with a heat pump. What's your experience of integrating them?
Well, going back in time, I often used to put solar thermal with a heat pump in, when I say often, sometimes, because often the customer, they wanted various things and they wanted to integrate that. And that's fine, it works quite well. Solar thermal per square meter is more energy efficient than PV. In other words, if you have PV, I think the efficiency is something like at best 20%, which is fine. so there's some advantages of solar thermal in that you can get them on your, you can get more out of a certain area, but that's not usually the problem. So in a way, PVs are a lot more flexible. And of course, quite a few systems I've been involved in will have an immersion heater and have a PV involved. And what should happen is that the if it's heating the cylinder for free in the summer, then the heat pump just won't come in, won't work. So it should automatically work. I think that's all I need to say. But only that on the other hand, if you're buying what, if you're spending on a technology, sometimes having PV and you've already got a heat pump which is fairly good, the PV should maybe be linked to oil boilers or something. But just on the topic of PV, I know some people say, "Oh, I want to put PVs in to run the heat pump." I would see them separately because you get these occasionally. There's one or two examples of a zero carbon school somewhere, which has a lot of PV and is an electrically heated building. It shouldn't really score that many points, because if it had a heat pump as well and it exported some electricity, it'd be better off. So, and of course, there's not really enough PV in the winter to run the heat pump. There's so much in the summer that you don't need the heat pump. So the two don't really match very easily. But, do both, but don't think too much. It's quite hard to run the heat pump in the day. A lot of the controls are not that simple. It sounds easy, but you try and get into the control to incentivize it to run in the day, and it's a little bit hard. You don't know whether the sun's coming out to wait for it, so it's not straightforward. But hopefully manufacturers are sort of working on that and working on sort of more integrated PV heat pumps.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just ask one other question that I saw go by from somebody who said, if you're putting in ground source heat pump, how big's the hole? So, John, how big's the hole?
Oh, well, if it's borehole, of course, you are talking about a hole, then it's not very big at all.
That's where you go straight down.
Go straight down, but you need the equipment to get there. And it's quite usually, it's often prohibitively expensive unless you're in a particularly good area, and maybe if you can do plenty of them. But the actual trench, well, there's different ways of doing it, but and the manufacturers, each one has a different way of doing it. But often it's a straight trench. And the picture I showed was probably 30-meter or 50-meter trenches. And typically houses need several, might need 3 trenches of up to 50 meters. Of course, it depends completely on the size of the system and and exactly what Gervais was saying. It's worth spending money on insulating just so you can have less ground disruption.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. And there was one other question from somebody saying, we had 6 people to stay at Christmas. What if we have a whole lot of guests and there's no hot water for them? How do you deal with those atypical periods when your demand goes up?
Well, probably actually most cylinders would, should have a top up in the top and the bottom for such times. There's no point in tailoring your system to cope with that time. It's not actually that much energy for your annual use. That those guests are not using much. So sometimes a point of view shower is actually acceptable. Not actually that much. But if you have a cylinder with an immersion at the bottom for Legionella, you don't really want to turn that on for your guests, because what's going to happen is it's going to be left on. The whole cylinder's hot. It's quite nice to have one on the top that will just help. But a heat pump may catch up. The guests just have to, I don't know to say this, but, sometimes they just have to, wait a bit, because the heat pump, particularly in the summer, it will catch up.
But one thing that you're saying people can do, and it's quite sensible for atypical usage, is to have instant electric showers, which will provide what's needed.
Well, I think so. of course, electricity was always shock horror. You know, you can't use that. It's bad, and it's sort of got better. But we got to be careful. One of the things against smaller heat pumps and a backup heater was if everyone turns on their boost heater at once, then the grid is going to grind to a halt. But generally speaking, with instant showers, you know, no one's going to be having showers at the same time. So there's a sort of, what's the word? You know, they will be spread out naturally. So they're not as bad as I used to think they were, actually.
Yeah.
And there's no standing loss, you know.
And one of the things you just mentioned is that the load on the electricity supply to your home. So sometimes when people are putting in a heat pump, and I don't know if this was the case for you, Dominic, you do actually need to improve the supply, upgrade the supply, don't you? Or is that now a rarity?
Hi. Our heat pump is rated at 6 kilowatts, and it's connected to our fuse box, if you like, or consumer unit, using a 16 amp cable or fused supply. That's a normal electricity supply within a house. It's completely normal. We had to have a separate cable run from the consumer unit, so from the fuse box to the air source heat pump. Fortunately, we had a spare place in the consumer unit to put one of those RCD type flick switches that are normally inside your consumer unit. Yeah, so it was pretty straightforward. So, but obviously, if you've got a big house and it's not very energy efficient, then you may need to have I mean, John can touch on this, but you may need to have your electricity supply improved. But that would only be if you were getting something bigger than 12 kilowatts or something like that of a heat pump. Is that right, John?
Yeah.
Or planning on charging a car as well?
Well, that may be okay. I mean, there's a big change now with the inverter drive. One of the big problems with heat pump compressors is they take quite a surge to start. Now, it's not an energy worry, but it's often about 5 times. And then there's soft start mechanisms which make it better. But the inverter drive heat pumps, which almost all of them now are, start softly. So Dominic's one there, 6 kilowatt. The actual input when it's running may rise to 2.5 at worst. Mostly it'll be under 2. And when it starts, it's a fraction of that. So now we should worry more about 10 kilowatt direct showers and things, really. But right, it's very important to actually check, because if the heat pump's big, you're duty bound to, well, you need to ask an electrician or the utility if you're allowed. In the old days, light dimming was a problem, and now it really isn't. And single phase heat pumps can be up to 22 kilowatts or so. They're much better now, because single phase, the heat pump compressor may be 3-phase inside, but it's got a single phase supply. So they've got, depending on the model, they're much bigger.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Well, so look, we're approaching 7 o'clock. What I forgot to say was that our kind of official run time is till 7, but we can overspill a bit. And I know there's still some questions to come, and we've also had an offer from Rob Palgrave to say a bit about his heat pump system that has been running well, I think, for 6 years. What I'd quite like to do is to just do our third and final poll, just see how relevant these questions are. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of it. So Wendy, if you're there and could run that for us, thank you. So I think if you can stick to a maximum of 3 of these. So what would hold you back from committing to a heat pump in the near future? I was going to say right now, but in the near future.
I think the poll's just disappeared there for a lot of people.
Has it? Let me just... I'll do it again. Okay. Oops.
I've relaunched it there, Jackie. It should be.
Yep. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody.
Maybe it's disappeared.
Let's see how it works. If it doesn't work quickly, we won't do it.
It disappeared again.
Oh, okay. Let's forget that then. Okay, that one is not.
It's running now.
Oh, good.
Yeah. One, if I can add something that I forgot to say.
Yeah, please go ahead.
We did get the Green Homes grants. We were successful. So if that's going to be a question, we got some money towards the system from the Green Homes grant, and we also will be getting the renewable heat incentive. But for us, it wasn't so much about the money; it was about the carbon savings. But so I don't know exactly what the renewable heat incentive will pay us. I haven't really looked into it, but I know we'll be getting that.
Yeah, but because you got the grant, it meant that, because normally with the RHI, which runs until March 2022, you pay for your installation and then get a payment over 7 years, which pays back. And there are calculators on that, by the way, that you can find online with, I think, on the MCS website. That's the Micro Generation Certification Scheme website. So yeah, but that only runs till next March, and then is likely to be replaced by the Clean Heat grant, which is currently under consultation, and we don't know exactly what it will say. So I think we're done now. So can you share the results, please, Wendy? So I don't know if these concerns seem to mirror your own, but I came up with them. So we've got about half the people thinking they would like to do insulation work first. They want a whole house plan. Some saying that sudden ending of the Green Homes grants has halted my plans. Fair enough. Looks like it might be time to wait and experiment then in that case. There's a year to get the RHI. It might be worth doing. It's likely to cost more than I can invest anyhow. Yes, they don't come cheap. We looked at some numbers, didn't we, Dominic and John? And I think an air source heat pump is typically £7,000 to £10,000 installed, possibly a little higher, and a ground source heat pump is likely to be in the range of 11 to 18, depending on the works, and those were more or less the numbers from the Energy Saving Trust. Concerned the cost of running it will be higher than expected. Well, we've learned that guidance is possible, and careful calculating can help you through that. Installing it will mean upheaval and mess. Well, it might. Worried it won't keep the house warm enough. That's actually our top response. So yeah, some people are not confident which installer to go with, and some are saying it doesn't, it's not for me right now. So I think that's really interesting, and thank you. And I wasn't trying to draw out the negatives, but just to see how people were gauging that. So thanks for that. Grand. Rob Palgrave, you've offered to say a few words then. We know you quite well as a fellow director, but now the secretary of our of Pomona Solar, our one of our Herefordshire solar co-ops. But I know you've got an air source heat pump there. What can you tell us about it?
Thank you, Jackie. I'll be very brief because I know we're due to finish a few minutes ago. I live in a detached dormer window bungalow. It's the EPC when I moved in was middle D, which means it's not super insulated by any means. When I moved in 2013, I put solar panels on, and 2014 I put in a lot of insulation in the house, which improved it, but by no means is it anywhere near passive house. In October 2014, I installed a 14 kilowatt air source heat pump, a Mitsubishi EcoDan, and it has a large water tank in the garage, and I had 8 out of the 10 radiators in the house enlarged. I don't have underfloor heating, I just have radiators. I have large windows, I have lots of solar gain in the summer because the windows face the right way, and we run the heat pump we run it 24 hours a day, and it's set at 19 degrees for the house in the daytime, 15 degrees overnight. So the temperature, if it really drops really cold in the night, the house is ticking over, so it's not stone cold in the morning. And I have to say, most mornings I get up, I find that even in the depths of winter, the temperature is round about 18 degrees, so it's doing a good job. I track the energy consumption, but not to the extent that Dominic does. But I can say that each year we use very close to 4,000 kilowatt hours of electricity just to run the heat pump. I've got a separate meter on the heat pump, which gives me that information. So that costs me about 600 and something pounds a year for electricity to run the heating. Now, my estimation is that if I had gas, and I don't because I live out in the country, I'd probably be spending about the same amount on gas. So from my point of view, I don't think I would try and sell an air source heat pump to someone who's got on gas and say they're going to save money. So I don't think that's true. I run the radiators at 40 degrees, and I run the hot water tank at 50 degrees. But I have on the hot water side, I have a diverter switch so that when there is spare power or energy from the solar PV on the roof, it goes into the hot water cylinder. So that basically means from about May through to September, October, the hot water, all the hot water is being provided by the diverted solar PV. And I think that's a very cheap and simple and very effective arrangement to get the maximum out of your solar PV. So I'm not exporting as much to the grid as perhaps I would without that, but I'm making use of it myself. Does it keep the house warm enough? Well, some people might say 19 isn't warm enough, but we find it's perfectly comfortable. And I'll admit that on very, very cold days in the kitchen, which has a particularly small radiator, we do use a fan heater to just top things up, perhaps when we're cooking in the evening. But that, I estimate that's probably no more than 20 to 30 hours a year in total. So overall, I'd say I'm very happy with the heat pump. I'm also quite happy to entertain anybody who'd like to come around and have a longer chat about it and share the practical experience. So I'll leave it there. Any questions?
Thanks ever so much. Thanks ever so much, Rob. And I was actually wondering whether there are people who'd like to put their names in the chat who would be interested in being able to hook up with someone who's running a heat pump and do, more of a one-on-one chat with them. Or we could set up another meeting like this that's specifically to do that and share a bit more. So yeah, let me just come. Has anybody got particular questions for Rob? In particular, John, have you got questions for Rob?
I was going to ask him what size the heat loss of the house was, just for interest. Do you know what it is or not? I'm
afraid, John, without getting the original installer paperwork out, which I I don't have the figure in my head.
No, and it's good to hear you. No, it's good to hear your story anyway.
Yeah, they did detailed room by room heat loss calculations, which I have to say I think they were a bit approximate, because they were making assumptions about the fabric in certain places that I think were not correct.
Thank you.
Right, I've had a question there from Claire Jenkins. The noise, well, obviously the machine's outside, so we don't hear it in the house. I suspect the neighbours could probably hear it on a really quiet night. And I think that, you know, it's getting to be quite an old machine now. It's 7 years old. I'm sure the newer ones are probably quieter. But it might be a consideration if people are living in houses very close to other people, and you might have to take some account of where you install the air source heat pump, so it's not blowing directly at another person's windows or something and causing them a noise. But I don't think it's a problem, really.
Grand, thank you for that. So some people have said they'd like to be in touch with you, Rob, and I should also point out that Wendy, our administrator, HGN administrator, and in fact this is her last public event as administrator, because she's going to spend more time in her other role. So thank you, Wendy. Wendy also runs the Sustainability Centre at Queenswood, which had a heat pump installed about a year ago, and once COVID restrictions are reduced, that's going to be open and visitable, isn't it, Wendy, for people to actually do tours?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another thing for us to be looking out for. So I'm coming back to Gordon now. Have we got more questions, Gordon, that you've spotted, or indeed Wendy has spotted as they've gone past?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions as a theme. It's back to Dominic again about the costs for the external installation in order to get down to that wonderful figure. Have you got any idea for it? Just on mute, Dominic.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention we also got PV, but the whole house retrofit cost £22,000. That's not the air source heat pump, that's the whole house retrofit that we had done by Carbon Co-op. Of that, about 6,000 was the PV and about 7,000 was the external wall insulation. And then the rest of the 22,000 was the other bits and bobs, triple glazing, underfloor insulation, etc. Yeah, hopefully that answers that.
That was round the side wall, wasn't it, and round the rear of the house, not on the front, as I understand.
Not on the front because it's a semi-detached, so it would look odd. It would probably also require planning permission on the front. We actually have got a small cavity at the front. In the front wall does have is a cavity wall, so we've got cavity wall insulation in there. Okay. It's a 65mm cavity, so it's just about worthwhile having that cavity wall insulation in that wall. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from?
No, I thought you might have spotted some going past.
I'll have another look.
I think yes. No, that's great.
Exactly. About ducting, is it possible to duct in the hot air as a hot air rather than a wet system? I think there was a couple of questions about that.
That's basically like an air conditioning system, an air-to-air.
Air-to-air, yeah.
I mean, John can probably answer better than me. I did consider it as a sort of vague consideration. Obviously, the more rooms that you want to have, you've got to have one of those, as far as I know, you've got to have one of those cassette units on the wall close to the ceiling to blow air around. then you've got to have refrigerant pipes running to the outside unit. And it just seemed to me that it's more disruption. If you've already got radiators, it seems like a disruptive way to go. And also it won't do your hot water. So you'll need some other solution for that to add on.
I'll just say I've been doing a bit of work on this. In fact, I've written a blog on it. I haven't published it because someone was asking this question at a community hall, whether they can use air-to-air, and it's sort of debatable whether it's a proper heating system. Like, interestingly, I was asked by, in fact, Stroud Council to look at some of their tenants, because they had this odd situation that one or two their tenants had air-to-air, as Dominic described, the console thing. And they were describing, low energy bills compared to storage heaters, comfortable, no mold on the walls, and they loved them. And then some people hated them and wanted them ripped out. It all boiled down a little bit to how they're using it, and also if there's a sort of open plan house, they can work fairly well. But I think the issue there is the air, the volume of air. In warmer countries, they're used for cooling, and we like air movement. But if we have a longer winter than a summer, then you don't really want to blow air to warm up. But what I've found, trying to advise this village hall, it's amazing that the installers on a well-insulated building, they don't care what the insulation is. Most installers just go on a square footage, and they work on, I think, 150 watts per square meter, which is like vast, really. And personally, I think they could be a good form of heating, but not at that size. I mean, there's a few people who've got them, I think, around, and we could do with a bit of feedback. I did fit one in my kitchen just to try it, and concluded I didn't really like it, and fitted it in a log cabin, which it was destined for, and they love it, and they've had it for years. They find it really good. So there we go.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's certainly an option, isn't it? But it's not. It's also not what we're really used to in the UK. It's not a way of heat delivery that we're used to. Whereas in the States, it's quite common to have a hot air, warm air delivery, I think. And so it's a matter of what feels right. And I think that's also true that there is a lot of subjectivity to this whole issue of comfort, and different people do need different temperatures, either within a family that are living together. Some will be more comfortable at one temperature than another, and different people at different stages of their lives also require different temperatures. John, you said in the chat that you're a bit worried that you were concerned you'd got people worried about the temperatures.
Just on the poll, everyone's saying, I mean, the thing is, I can appear to be a little bit negative at times because I'm sort of looking for the problem. So hopefully they don't happen. And if you're used to salesmen, then, it's a bit of a contrast, but sometimes I worry about that. I just want to say one point there, which is quite important. This thing, we often forget the building we're looking at. For example, air, someone said, will air-to-air work? Well, of course, if it's a well-insulated building, everything's so much easier. If it's an older building, you may need a considerable draft of warm air, whereas if it's insulated, and mustn't forget that, you don't need so much air. I know someone in Aberystwyth who's got a air-to-air system, and he's very happy with it. So it can work, but I think with caution. And of course, they're very cheap.
John, could we ask you a question about the choice of refrigerant? It's come up quite a few times in the chat over the course of the evening. And obviously, there's concerns about different types of refrigerant that could be used.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a thing that concerns me. I've always liked sort of more natural refrigerants like hydrocarbons because, okay, the one thing is with a heat pump, hopefully it's hermetically sealed, so it shouldn't lose the refrigerant. It's the same as a fridge. It doesn't lose its refrigerant over its lifetime. nonetheless, we don't really want tons and tons of refrigerant around, because if it's released, the global warming potential is fairly high, but it will be a fraction of the carbon saving, we'd hope. And now they're coming out with R32, which is being labelled as a better refrigerant. It's about a third that of other refrigerants. It's quite a good refrigerant, but you can choose R290. Like most fridges now, they will use butane as the refrigerant, which is pretty benign, really, very good. Some heat pump models do use R290, which is excellent. And of course, some have got the refrigerant is actually CO2 itself, but that's a different animal, really. And yeah, it's a mistake to think that refrigerant it's got its certain uses for higher temperature. I think that's all okay. I mean, people have different opinions whether how important that is. I tend to sit in the middle, really. But personally, I would much rather go for an hydrocarbon if I could.
Do you think the savings from an air source heat pump widely rolled out massively outweigh the risk of leaking of the refrigerant, regardless of its type? Almost, is that what you're saying?
I've got a page on that on my website, which discusses that, but I don't know if I've updated it for the that much for the lecture. I think I have actually. Okay. Yes, but of course, if you're unfortunate enough to have a leak which is very unlikely, but of course then that cancels out the savings. But you'd hope that you buy a heat pump, it's got refrigerant in, before it's scrapped, the refrigerant is recovered. It should be.
And that's the process, isn't it, with refrigerators and freezers? You know, they all have a certain amount of these refrigerants in them, and that does need to be extracted safely when they go to recycling.
Yeah, fridges will extract, maybe 60, 70, 80%. I don't know actually now, but it's not all of it. But with the heat pump, you'll probably recover 90% of it. The thing is, the refrigerants are very expensive. So, in fact, engineers would tend to recover it anyway. It's very expensive now.
Yeah. Good. Grant, I think we're about to draw to a close. So if someone has got questions that they haven't yet asked, or they've perhaps not been able to type them in, please wave frantically at this stage because we don't want to miss you. Yes, Daniel Cox is waving frantically. Hi, Daniel. What would you...
Just a super quick question for John. If you have a system sized for doing your domestic hot water and your heating in the winter, what's the performance of it like in the summer if you just run it for domestic hot water?
Right, I was typing a thing about a car AC being leaky, air conditioning. Say that again, sorry.
So if you have a system sized for doing your heating and your hot water, and then in the summer you just use it for your hot water, what does that do to its performance? That's sort of fine. I mean, when it's doing its hot water, it'll be just doing, its COP might be 2.5, 3. Of course, in the summer, if it's air source, it's quite good because the air's warm, so it will be working quite well. Does that answer it? There's no compromise anywhere. I mean, it does one or the other, and it's fine.
Great, thank you. Any more frantic waving? You see, it does work. Who am I missing? I'm not getting everyone on my screen. No, I see no more frantic waving. So there we are. So I think, unless there are some closing comments from John or from Dominic, maybe you've got some final thoughts you'd like to leave with everybody, or some final thoughts that others who've listened in have got, then we'll be ending shortly. John or Dominic, any final comments?
Thanks for having me.
Well,
One thing I was going to, it was interesting listening to Dominic and his recording, because I've sort of lost the plot a bit with recording. It's always good to note down, you know, what your running costs are and get if you've got a heat pump, you should know what it's using. A lot of people guess or think, oh, I don't really know what it's costing to run. But the other thing is just driving them well, I suppose, because quite a lot of heat pumps still are probably just not set up very well. So the temperature of the radiators are hotter than or rather the water that's being produced is a bit hotter than it should be, but it's actually quite hard to get to the bottom of that sometimes. And obviously I can't answer that, but it's worth sort of, I wouldn't say necessarily servicing it, but well, because you don't always get things answered, but keeping an eye on it yourself really, and reading the manual and engaging with things like heating curves and things like that.
Yeah, and that probably goes for people who don't have a heat pump but have something else as well. It's worth actually just getting a bit more engaged with how it functions, so you can get the best out of it. And I know with the gas boiler, getting them running at a lower temperature, as Dominic showed, means you can cut your gas consumption by 15% with a weather compensator or something. They would all take it, but it's a lovely experience if anybody fancies it. Great. Good. Well, look, thank you so very much, everybody. In particular, John and Dominic, also Gervais, who was here earlier. Thank you all for contributing. Yeah, Rob, for telling us about your experience. And yes, let's see if we can gather again with those who have installed, or yeah, just give a wave of hands if you like the idea of having more informal chats about this with people who have got installations and what have you. Oh yeah, there's some waving. Good. We'll see how we can follow up then. Terrific. Well, thank you very, very much. The team might want to just stay on the line, but for everyone else, we'll say good night, goodbye. Go and enjoy the newly damp outdoors. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.